The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, stood motionless in front of her dressing-room mirror, her reflection staring back with eyes that held secrets too heavy for words. The diamond earrings that Prince William had given her on their 5th wedding anniversary caught the light, but today they felt like weights pulling her down into an ocean of uncertainty. Outside her window, the usual crowd of photographers and royal watchers had already begun to gather. They came every day now, sensing something was different about the royal couple who had once been the picture of modern monarchy perfection. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her pearl necklace, the same one she had worn to countless official engagements, charity events, and state dinners. Today, however, it felt like armor she was putting on for the last time. Down the corridor, Prince William sat in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and official documents that suddenly seemed meaningless. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from palace officials, government representatives, and family members, but he couldn't bring himself to answer any of them. The weight of the crown had always been heavy, but lately it felt like it was crushing not just him, but everything he held dear. The couple had barely spoken to each other in 3 days, not since the conversation that had changed everything between them. It wasn't a fight in the traditional sense, but rather a moment of brutal honesty that had shattered the carefully constructed facade they had maintained for years. Catherine had finally voiced what they both had been thinking, but were too afraid to say out loud. Their children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, had already left for school, blissfully unaware that their parents' world was falling apart behind closed doors. The staff moved through the palace with practiced efficiency, but even they could sense the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. Mrs. Henderson, Catherine's longtime lady-in-waiting, had noticed how the Duchess had stopped eating properly and how her usually bright smile had faded into something forced and brittle. William remembered the exact moment when everything began to unravel. It was during a private dinner at Sandringham, just the two of them, when Catherine had looked up from her barely touched meal and said the words that would haunt him forever. She had spoken about duty versus happiness, about the children growing up in a fishbowl, about the constant scrutiny that was slowly eating away at her soul. She had talked about dreams deferred and a life that felt increasingly like a performance, rather than something real and authentic. The pressure from the media had been relentless for months. Every public appearance was dissected, every gesture analyzed, every interaction between them scrutinized for signs of trouble. The tabloids had started running stories about tension in their marriage, most of which were fabricated, but some of which hit uncomfortably close to the truth. Catherine had stopped reading the papers altogether, but William knew she was aware of every headline, every speculation, every cruel comment from online trolls who felt entitled to judge their private lives. That morning, as Catherine applied her makeup with hands that shook slightly, she thought about the woman she used to be before she became a duchess. She remembered the freedom of walking down a street without security details, of making spontaneous decisions, of having conversations that weren't carefully monitored and reported. She thought about her sister Pippa's life, filled with normal problems and ordinary joys, and felt a stab of envy so sharp it took her breath away. William, meanwhile, was remembering his mother's words about the price of duty and the sacrifices required by the crown. Princess Diana had tried to prepare him for this life, but she had also shown him what happened when the pressure became too much to bear. He saw echoes of his mother's struggles in Catherine's eyes lately, and it terrified him more than any royal protocol or state responsibility ever could. The palace staff had been instructed to prepare for a special announcement, though they hadn't been told what it would contain. The official photographer had been called in, and the press secretary had scheduled an unusual afternoon briefing. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury had been contacted, though his role in the day's events remained mysteriously undefined. As the morning progressed, William and Catherine found themselves moving through their routines like actors in a play they no longer wanted to perform. Catherine attended to her correspondence, signing thank you notes and responding to charitable requests with the same gracious tone she had perfected over the years. William reviewed briefing papers for upcoming engagements, his mind barely processing the words on the pages before him. The couple's protection officers noticed the unusual tension, but maintained their professional silence. They had been with William and Catherine long enough to recognize when something significant was happening, and today felt different from all the other difficult days they had witnessed. There was a finality in the air, a sense that something precious and carefully built was about to come to an end. By noon, the crowd outside the palace had grown larger, as word had somehow leaked that an important announcement was expected. Social media buzzed with speculation, with royal watchers and ordinary citizens alike trying to guess what news would be shared. Some hoped for pregnancy announcements or new royal titles, while others feared the worst, remembering the shocking revelations that had rocked the royal family in recent years. Catherine looked at her wedding ring, twisting it slowly on her finger as she had done countless times in recent weeks. The band that had once symbolized hope and new beginnings now felt like a beautiful chain that bound her to a life she wasn't sure she could continue living. The woman who had once dreamed of being a princess had learned that fairy tales and reality were very different things, and that sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome the weight of expectation and duty. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 1 o'clock, its deep, resonant tone echoing through the corridors of Kensington Palace like a funeral bell. Catherine closed her eyes and took a deep breath, knowing that in just 2 hours everything would change forever. She had spent the morning writing letters to her children, carefully choosing words that might help them understand why their mother had to make such an impossible choice. William found her in the blue drawing room, standing by the window that overlooked the gardens where their children had played just yesterday. She didn't turn around when he entered, but he could see her shoulders tense at the sound of his footsteps on the Persian carpet. They had been avoiding each other all morning, both knowing that once they spoke, once they looked into each other's eyes, the painful conversation they had been postponing would finally have to happen. "The cars will be here at 3, William said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The official vehicles that would take them to their final public appearance as the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge sat waiting in the palace courtyard, their polished surfaces reflecting the gray London sky like mirrors of their own fractured dreams. Catherine finally turned to face him, and William felt his heart break all over again at the sight of her face. The woman he had fallen in love with at university, the one who had laughed at his jokes and challenged his ideas, and made him believe that duty and happiness could coexist, looked like a ghost of herself. Her eyes, once so bright and full of hope, now held a sadness so deep it seemed to pull all the light from the room. "I keep thinking about our wedding day," Catherine said, her voice catching slightly on the words. "Do you remember how confident we were? How certain we were that love would be enough to overcome anything?" She touched the sapphire engagement ring that had belonged to his mother, the same ring that had once symbolized hope and new beginnings for another young woman who had struggled with the weight of royal expectations. William moved closer to her, close enough to catch the familiar scent of her perfume, the one she had worn since their early days together. "I remember thinking that as long as we had each other we could handle whatever came our way," he replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "I was so naive. I thought my love for you would be enough to protect you from all of this." They had tried everything to make their marriage work within the constraints of royal life. Catherine had thrown herself into her charitable work, becoming a passionate advocate for children's mental health and early childhood development. William had modernized his approach to royal duties, trying to make the monarchy more relevant and accessible to ordinary people. Together they had presented a picture of modern royalty that had captivated the world and restored faith in an institution that had been badly damaged by previous scandals. But behind the glossy magazine covers and the carefully choreographed public appearances, the pressure had been slowly grinding them down. Catherine had developed anxiety that kept her awake at night, worrying about every public appearance, every photograph, every potential misstep that could become front-page news. William had watched helplessly as the woman he loved gradually retreated into herself, becoming more and more isolated despite being constantly surrounded by people. The breaking point had come 3 weeks earlier, during a routine charity visit to a children's hospital. Catherine had been reading to a group of young patients when one little girl, no older than Princess Charlotte, had asked her if she was happy being a princess. The innocence of the question and the honesty it demanded had hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had managed to finish the visit, smiling and laughing with the children, but that night she had cried for hours in William's arms, finally admitting that she wasn't sure she could continue living a lie. The children deserve parents who are authentic, Catherine said now, echoing the conversation that had kept them both awake for weeks. How can we teach them to be true to themselves when we're living lives that feel increasingly false? She thought about George, already showing signs of the pressure that came with being heir to the heir, about Charlotte's questions about why they couldn't just go to the park like normal families, about Louis's confusion over why strangers were always taking their pictures. William knew she was right, but the knowledge felt like acid in his stomach. His entire life had been built around the assumption that he would one day be king, that duty to the crown came before personal happiness. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had embodied this principle for over 70 years, sacrificing her own desires for the greater good of the monarchy and the nation. But watching Catherine struggle had made him question everything he had been taught about duty and sacrifice. The palace staff had been briefed on the afternoon's events, though they had been given only the bare minimum of information. The Queen's private secretary had made several urgent phone calls to Buckingham Palace that morning, and there had been whispered conversations in corridors about precedent and constitutional implications. Everyone knew that what was about to happen had no modern precedent in the British royal family. Catherine's parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, had arrived at the palace that morning, their faces grave with worry and sadness. They had watched their daughter transform from a confident, happy young woman into someone who jumped at camera flashes and seemed to shrink into herself at public events. Carol had tried to offer support and advice, but she knew that no amount of maternal love could shield Catherine from the unique pressures of royal life. Prince Charles had requested an emergency meeting with William the night before, during which the future king had tried to convince his son to reconsider. Charles had spoken about duty, about the stability of the monarchy, about the damage that such a drastic decision could inflict on the institution they were all bound to serve. But he had also seen the pain in his son's eyes and remembered his own struggles with marriage, duty, and the impossible choice between personal happiness and royal obligation. The media had no idea what was coming. Royal correspondents had noticed the unusual activity around Kensington Palace and the scheduling of an unexpected press briefing, but their speculation ranged from pregnancy announcements to new charity initiatives. None of them could have imagined that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change the British monarchy and capture the attention of the entire world. As 2 o'clock approached, William and Catherine found themselves holding hands for what they both knew might be the last time as husband and wife. The decision they had made would affect not just their own lives, but the lives of their children, their families, and millions of people around the world who had invested emotionally in their love story. The weight of that responsibility felt almost unbearable, but they both knew that continuing to live a lie would be even worse. The black Range Rovers pulled up to the steps of St. James's Palace at exactly 3 o'clock, their engines humming quietly in the unusually still afternoon air. Catherine sat in the back seat of the first vehicle, her hands folded carefully in her lap, watching the familiar London streets pass by for what she knew would be the last time as a member of the royal family. The journey from Kensington Palace had taken only 12 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. William rode in the second car, staring out at the crowds that had begun to gather along the route. Word had spread through social media that something significant was happening, and curious onlookers lined the sidewalks, their phones raised to capture whatever historic moment was about to unfold. None of them could have guessed that they were witnessing the end of what had been called the greatest royal love story of the modern era. Inside St. James's Palace, the press room had been transformed for the occasion. Additional seating had been brought in to accommodate the unexpectedly large media presence, and television crews from around the world had set up their cameras and lighting equipment. The room buzzed with nervous energy as journalists and photographers tried to piece together clues about what was to come. The palace's unusual secrecy had only fueled more speculation. Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Mrs. Henderson, had packed a small overnight bag for the Duchess, though its contents remained a mystery to everyone except Catherine herself. The bag contained personal items that couldn't be replaced, photographs of her children, letters from her grandmother, the simple gold bracelet William had given her during their university days, and a small notebook where she had been secretly recording her thoughts and feelings over the past difficult months. As the cars pulled into the palace courtyard, Catherine caught sight of her reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a simple navy blue dress that had always been one of William's favorites, paired with the pearl earrings his grandmother had given her as a wedding gift. She wanted to look dignified and composed, even as her world was falling apart around her. The palace's private chapel had been the site of their final conversation as a married couple the night before. Surrounded by centuries of royal history and the portraits of monarchs who had struggled with their own impossible choices, William and Catherine had held each other and wept for the life they were about to leave behind. They had talked about their children, about how to explain the unexplainable, about how to protect 3 innocent young people from the media storm that was about to engulf their family. Prince George, now 10 years old, had begun to suspect that something was wrong. He had inherited his father's intelligence and his mother's emotional sensitivity, and the tension in the household had not escaped his notice. Princess Charlotte VIII had been asking more questions about why her parents seemed sad all the time, while 5-year-old Prince Louis remained blissfully unaware that his world was about to change forever. The Queen had been informed of the decision 3 days earlier, during a private audience that had lasted nearly 2 hours. Elizabeth II, in the twilight of her remarkable reign, had listened with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades balancing personal sacrifice with public duty. She had shared stories of her own struggles, of moments when the weight of the crown had felt unbearable, of the prices she had paid for a lifetime of service. But she had also understood that times had changed, that the pressures faced by modern royals were different from those of previous generations. King Charles had spent the morning at Highgrove, walking alone through the gardens that had always brought him peace during times of crisis. The future king understood better than anyone the weight of expectation that pressed down on his eldest son. His own marriage to Diana had been destroyed by the impossible demands of royal life, and he had watched with growing concern as history seemed to repeat itself with William and Catherine. The Archbishop of Canterbury waited in his private office, having been called upon to provide counsel during one of the most unusual situations in the history of the Church of England. The religious implications of what was about to happen would reverberate through the institution that had been shaped by royal marriage and divorce for centuries. He had spent hours in prayer, seeking guidance for a situation that had no clear precedent in modern times. As Catherine stepped out of her car, the click of camera shutters filled the air like a mechanical symphony. She had learned to ignore the sound over the years, but today each click felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of her old life. Her security detail formed a protective barrier around her, but she could still feel the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her every movement, analyzing her expression for clues about what was to come. William emerged from his vehicle a moment later, his face a mask of controlled composure that barely concealed the turmoil beneath. He had inherited his grandmother's ability to maintain dignity under pressure, but those who knew him well could see the pain in his eyes. The man who had once joked and laughed easily now carried himself with the weight of someone much older than his 41 years. The couple met at the entrance to the palace, their hands briefly touching as they had done thousands of times before at official events. But this time the gesture felt different, charged with the electricity of finality. They walked side by side down the familiar corridors, past portraits of William's ancestors, past rooms where they had attended countless meetings and receptions, past the life they were about to leave behind forever. Inside the press room, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades sat alongside international journalists who sensed they were about to witness something historic. Television producers spoke urgently into their headsets, ensuring that their networks were ready to broadcast whatever announcement was about to be made to a global audience. The palace's press secretary, a man who had served the royal family for over 20 years, stood at the podium checking his notes one final time. He had handled countless royal announcements from births and marriages to deaths and divorces, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the carefully worded statement that would soon shock the world and bring an end to one of the most beloved chapters in modern royal history. Outside the palace walls, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in just minutes everything would change. Traffic moved through the streets, tourists posed for photos outside Buckingham Palace, and ordinary people went about their lives, not knowing that they were about to witness the end of a fairy tale that had captured hearts around the world. The press room fell into an unusual hush as William and Catherine entered together. their footsteps echoing against the polished floor with a finality that seemed to resonate through the very walls of the historic palace. The assembled journalists who had covered countless royal events over the years immediately sensed that something unprecedented was about to unfold. The couple's body language spoke volumes to those trained to read the subtle signs of royal distress. Catherine took her place at the microphone first, her hands gripping the edges of the podium with a strength that belied her composed exterior. She had practiced this moment in her mind hundreds of times, but standing before the world's media with the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders felt surreal. The woman who had once been hailed as the perfect modern princess now faced the impossible task of explaining why perfection had not been enough. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine began, her voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions churning beneath the surface. "Thank you for joining us today. What we have to share with you is deeply personal, but we believe that honesty and transparency are owed to those who have supported us throughout our journey together." The room was so quiet that the sound of camera shutters seemed unnaturally loud, each click capturing a moment that would be dissected and analyzed for generations to come. She paused, gathering the strength to continue, her eyes briefly meeting William's before returning to the sea of faces before her. "After much reflection and many difficult conversations, Prince William and I have made the decision to end our marriage and step back from our roles as senior members of the royal family." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Catherine could actually hear several people in the room gasp in shock. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Veteran royal correspondents, who prided themselves on maintaining professional composure, sat with their mouths slightly open in disbelief. Camera operators focused their lenses with new intensity, knowing they were documenting a moment that would be replayed endlessly in documentaries and news reports for decades to come. Social media administrators watching the live stream began typing frantically, trying to capture the magnitude of what they were witnessing. William stepped forward to join Catherine at the microphone, his presence both protective and supportive. "This decision has not been made lightly," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of royal training in maintaining dignity under impossible circumstances. "We have spent months in consideration, seeking counsel and exploring every possible alternative. But we have come to understand that our commitment to honesty, both with ourselves and with those we serve, requires us to acknowledge that our marriage can no longer continue." In living rooms across Britain and around the world, people stopped what they were doing as news alerts flashed across their television screens and phones. The announcement was being broadcast live to a global audience of hundreds of millions, all watching in stunned silence as one of the world's most famous couples dismantled their fairy tale in real time. The hashtag Our Royal announcement began trending within minutes. As social media exploded with shock, disbelief, and speculation, Catherine's parents, watching from a private room within the palace, held each other tightly as they witnessed their daughter's pain being broadcast to the world. Carol Middleton had always worried about the pressures that royal life would place on Catherine, but she had hoped that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. Now, watching her daughter's composed but heartbroken delivery, she felt a mixture of pride at Catherine's courage and devastation at the price she was paying for honesty. "We want to be absolutely clear that this decision is about us, about our marriage, and about our inability to continue living authentically within the constraints that our positions require," William continued, his words carefully chosen to deflect blame from the institution of monarchy itself. "Our children remain our absolute priority, and we are committed to co-parenting them with love, respect, and the privacy they deserve during this difficult transition." The mention of George, Charlotte, and Louis sent another wave of emotion through the room. These three children, who had grown up in the public eye as symbols of the monarchy's future, would now have to navigate the complexities of divorced parents while maintaining their places in the line of succession. Royal historians in the audience immediately began calculating the constitutional implications of this unprecedented situation. Queen Elizabeth II, watching from Windsor Castle, felt the weight of her 97 years more heavily than ever before. She had witnessed the abdication crisis of 1936, lived through the breakdown of 3 of her children's marriages, and guided the monarchy through countless scandals and challenges. But watching her great-grandson and his wife announce the end of their marriage felt like witnessing the closing of a chapter that had brought such hope and renewal to the royal family. "Ask for your understanding and respect for our "Privacy as we navigate this transition," Catherine said, her voice beginning to show the strain of maintaining composure while her heart was breaking. "We also ask that you respect the privacy of our children, who did not choose this public life and who deserve the space to process this change in their family without intrusion or speculation." The international implications of the announcement were immediate and far-reaching. Commonwealth leaders were being briefed in real time about the constitutional questions that would need to be addressed. The Archbishop of Canterbury prepared for the difficult conversations that would follow about the Church of England's position on royal divorce and remarriage. Financial markets began to react as traders tried to assess the impact on British tourism and the various commercial enterprises associated with the royal brand. In the press room, seasoned journalists struggled to formulate questions that could capture the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This was not just the end of a marriage, but the unraveling of a story that had defined modern royalty for over a decade. The couple who had revitalized the monarchy's image and brought hope to an institution many had considered outdated were now stepping away from it all. William's voice carried a note of finality as he approached the conclusion of their statement. "We have been privileged to serve alongside the Queen and to represent the values and traditions that make this nation great. While our personal journey together has come to an end, our commitment to the causes we care about and to the people who have supported us remains unchanged, albeit in different capacities." The room remained silent, waiting for more, but Catherine stepped back from the microphone, indicating that their prepared statement was complete. The couple stood together for a moment, united in their grief even as they announced their separation, before turning to leave the room that had witnessed so many royal announcements over the centuries. None had been quite like this one. As William and Catherine turned to leave the podium, the dam of professional restraint finally burst in the press room. Hands shot up frantically as reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and desperation for more details. But the couple had said what they came to say, and they walked away with their hands briefly touching, a gesture of solidarity in the face of unimaginable scrutiny. The questions followed them down the corridor. "Your Royal Highnesses, will you remain in the line of succession? What about the children's titles? Will there be a formal divorce?" But William and Catherine continued walking, their security detail forming a protective barrier against the pursuing journalists who had momentarily forgotten royal protocol in their shock. Behind them, the press secretary attempted to restore order to the chaos that had erupted in the wake of their announcement. "There will be no questions at this time," he said firmly into the microphone, though his words were barely audible over the commotion. "Written statements with additional details will be provided to all accredited media outlets within the hour." But his efforts were largely futile as the assembled journalists continued shouting, their professional composure completely shattered by the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. In a private drawing room adjacent to the press area, William and Catherine finally allowed themselves a moment of private grief. Catherine sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking as the reality of what they had just done hit her with full force. 13 years of marriage, 3 beautiful children, and a love story that had captivated the world had just been reduced to a few carefully worded sentences delivered to a room full of strangers. William knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his as tears finally began to fall down both their faces. "We did it," he whispered, though the words felt hollow in the wake of such devastating finality. "It's done." They had rehearsed this moment, prepared for the media storm that would follow, and steeled themselves for the constitutional crisis they were about to create. But nothing could have prepared them for the emptiness that followed the actual announcement. Outside the palace, crowds had begun to gather as news of the announcement spread through social media and live television coverage. Many people stood in stunned silence, holding their phones and staring at the headlines that seemed too shocking to be real. Others wept openly, grieving for a couple they had never met but whose love story had somehow become part of their own emotional landscape. The children had been taken to Anmer Hall, the family's country home in Norfolk, where they would be shielded from the immediate media frenzy. Prince George, old enough to understand that something momentous was happening, sat quietly in the garden with his siblings, trying to process the conversations he had overheard and the unusual tension that had filled their home for weeks. Princess Charlotte kept asking when Mummy and Daddy would come home, while Prince Louis played with his toys. blissfully unaware that his world was about to change forever. King Charles arrived at St. James's Palace within an hour of the announcement, his face grave with concern for his son and daughter-in-law. The future king had experienced his own marital difficulties under the intense scrutiny of public life, and he understood better than most the impossible pressures that had led to this moment. His first priority was ensuring that William and Catherine had the support they needed during what would undoubtedly be the most difficult period of their lives. The constitutional implications of the announcement were already being debated in emergency sessions across Westminster. William remained second in line to the throne, but questions arose about his suitability as a future king without a queen consort. Catherine's role as a future queen had been central to the monarchy's modernization efforts, and her departure created a vacuum that would be difficult to fill. International reaction was swift and emotional. The Prime Minister issued a statement expressing support for the royal family's right to privacy, while acknowledging the significant constitutional questions that would need to be addressed. Commonwealth leaders found themselves fielding questions about the stability of the monarchy and the implications for their own relationships with the British Crown. In the hours following the announcement, Kensington Palace was besieged by media from around the world. Satellite trucks lined the streets, reporters did live broadcasts from every possible angle, and aerial footage showed the scale of the global interest in this unprecedented royal drama. The palace's usually efficient press operation was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of requests for information and access. Catherine's charitable organizations scrambled to understand what her departure from royal duties would mean for their future. She had been a passionate advocate for early childhood development, mental health awareness, and photography education. The uncertainty about her continued involvement left many wondering about the fate of projects that had been years in development and had relied heavily on her royal platform for success. The reaction from ordinary citizens was perhaps the most poignant aspect of the unfolding drama. Social media was flooded with messages of support, sadness, and confusion. Many people shared their own stories of divorce and relationship difficulties, finding a strange comfort in knowing that even fairy tale couples faced the same challenges as everyone else. Others expressed anger at what they saw as a betrayal of the institution they had trusted and supported. Royal historians worked frantically to find precedents for what was happening, but the closest comparison was the abdication crisis of 1936, when King Edward VIII gave up the throne for love. This situation was different but equally unprecedented. A future king and his wife choosing honesty over duty, personal happiness over institutional stability. As evening fell over London, William and Catherine found themselves alone together for what they knew might be the last time as husband and wife. They sat in the same blue drawing room where they had shared so many private moments over the years, surrounded by the memories of a life they were choosing to leave behind. The weight of their decision felt both crushing and liberating, a paradox that would define their emotional state for months to come. "Do you think we'll regret this?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper in the gathering darkness. The question hung between them like a bridge they might never cross again, loaded with all the uncertainty and fear that comes with making choices that cannot be undone. William was quiet for a long moment, considering not just her question but the broader implications of what they had set in motion. "I think we'll regret it less than we would have regretted continuing to live a lie," he finally replied, though his voice carried the weight of someone who wasn't entirely certain of his own words. 6 months after the announcement that shook the world, Catherine Middleton walked through Hyde Park on a crisp autumn morning, her anonymity restored in ways she had forgotten were possible. Gone were the security details, the carefully planned routes, and the constant awareness of cameras tracking her every movement. For the first time in over a decade, she could simply exist without the weight of royal expectation pressing down upon her shoulders. The divorce had been finalized quietly, with dignity and mutual respect that had surprised even the most cynical royal watchers. William had insisted that Catherine retain her HRH status and a generous financial settlement that would ensure her independence and the children's security. The legal proceedings had been conducted with unprecedented privacy, away from the media circus that had initially surrounded their separation. William had chosen to remain in the line of succession, but he had also stepped back from many of his royal duties to focus on co-parenting their children and reassessing his own relationship with duty and service. King Charles had taken on additional responsibilities as he prepared for his eventual reign, understanding that his son needed time to heal and rediscover his purpose beyond the confines of traditional royal expectations. The children had adapted with the resilience that young people often display in the face of change. Prince George had initially struggled with the media attention and the whispered conversations of classmates, but therapy and the unwavering support of both parents had helped him develop coping strategies. Princess Charlotte had become fiercely protective of her younger brother, Prince Louis, who had accepted the new family dynamic with the easy adaptability of a child who simply wanted his parents to be happy. Catherine had returned to her passion for photography, opening a small studio in Chelsea where she worked with families and children, finding healing in capturing moments of genuine joy and connection. The work gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing during her years of royal duties. When every public appearance had felt scripted and every genuine emotion had to be carefully managed for public consumption, the media attention had gradually diminished as other stories captured public interest. Though Catherine's every public appearance still generated headlines, she had learned to navigate this new reality with grace, understanding that complete privacy would never be possible but grateful for the relative freedom she had gained. Her relationship with the royal family had evolved into something more complex but ultimately healthier. Queen Elizabeth II had privately expressed her understanding and support, recognizing that Catherine's decision had taken tremendous courage. The Queen had lived through enough royal scandals to understand that authenticity and honesty, even when painful, were ultimately better for the monarchy's long-term survival than maintaining beautiful facades that concealed deep unhappiness. William had begun dating again, quietly and carefully, though he remained focused primarily on his children and his evolving role within the royal family. The pressure to remarry quickly had been intense from certain quarters, but he had insisted on taking time to understand what he truly wanted from life and love, rather than simply fulfilling institutional expectations. The constitutional questions raised by their divorce had led to meaningful discussions about modernizing the monarchy for the 21st century. Parliament had quietly begun examining laws around royal marriage and divorce, recognizing that the institution needed to adapt to reflect contemporary values while maintaining its essential character and continuity. Catherine's charitable work had continued in a different capacity, with several organizations she had supported as a royal, choosing to maintain their relationships with her as a private citizen. Her advocacy for children's mental health had actually become more effective in some ways, as she could speak more freely about her own struggles and the importance of seeking help when traditional expectations became overwhelming. On this particular morning in Hyde Park, Catherine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment of unexpected peace. The pain of the divorce had been real and profound, but so had been the relief of no longer having to pretend that everything was perfect when it clearly wasn't. She had discovered that happiness didn't always look like what society expected it to look like. A young mother, pushing a stroller, recognized her and offered a shy smile, the kind of natural human interaction that had been impossible during her royal years when every encounter was mediated by protocol and security concerns. Catherine smiled back, enjoying the simple pleasure of being seen as a person rather than a symbol. Her phone buzzed with a text from William about the children's weekend plans, and she found herself grateful for the co-parenting relationship they had managed to build from the ashes of their marriage. They had discovered that they could be better parents apart than they had been as a couple struggling to maintain an impossible balance between public duty and private authenticity. The fairy tale ending that the world had wanted for them had been replaced by something more honest and ultimately more valuable. Two people who had chosen truth over convenience, authenticity over appearance, and personal growth over institutional inertia. Their love story hadn't ended with the traditional happily ever after, but it had evolved into something deeper and more real. As Catherine continued her walk through the park, she thought about the letter she had written to her younger self the night before, full of advice about trusting her instincts and understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go of what isn't working, even when the whole world is watching and judging your choices. The tears that had once fallen in private drawing rooms had been replaced by a quiet contentment that came from living an authentic life. The princess who had captured the world's imagination had transformed into a woman who had found the courage to write her own ending, and in doing so, had given others permission to do the same. William, meanwhile, had discovered that duty and personal happiness didn't have to be mutually exclusive if approached with honesty and creativity. His relationship with his future role as king had been fundamentally transformed by the experience of choosing authenticity over expectation, and he had become a more thoughtful and empathetic leader as a result. The world had eventually stopped watching quite so intently, moving on to other stories and other dramas. But for those who had witnessed their tearful goodbye to a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow from within, William and Catherine had demonstrated that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that even fairy tales need to end when they stop serving the people living them. Their story had become something different than what anyone had expected. But perhaps it was something better, a testament to the power of choosing truth over fiction, even when the cost of that choice is everything you thought you wanted. In the end, they had found something more valuable than a perfect public image. They had found themselves.